9 months ago at the Westminster Business School, we have embarked into a mission to explore leadership in the voluntary sector. And pretty much what we are aiming to do is to steal knowledge, concepts, and experiences from the third sector and then transfer it into the greedy corporations that we are trying to help with leadership models. I know that when we are engaged into research or practice in a specific field, we tend to see the negative side of it. So, for example, we work in universities and we always tend to say we lack academic leadership. You know, we don't have enough leaders in academia. Then we go into business, the business sector, and we always complain about, you know, the lack of capable people for handling change, for example. However, if you look at the leadership in the voluntary sector from our perspective, from researchers looking at leadership in corporations, we are finding out that there are many interesting concepts, ideas, practices, and behaviors that can really inform the mainstream leadership theory. And this is our starting point for this research. Another thing I have to say is that I have to apologize for not having a title for the paper today because it keeps changing every day. It's becoming a daily routine for me and Katalin to change the title of the paper, but also to some extent to change the focus and the main analytical strands, as I'm going to analyze later on. So there is no title, which you see how it keeps changing. By the way, in a very interesting way, even my department's name is not valid anymore because I got an email this morning that we are being restructured and renamed into Department of Organizations and Leadership. So nothing is valid on this first slide. I think that's interesting because this is what's happening actually today in organizations. This fluidity, this tendency to constantly change and evolve, this idea that we don't have fixed structures in organizations today is part of the reality for most organizational contexts. Bauman talked about the liquid society where nothing is fixed, where relationships are changing and shaping every day. And then if we go into the sociology of Giddens and even Thompson, we look at how structures in society today can never be taken for granted. Nothing is given, and this really influences how we lead, how we manage, how we behave in organizations. And we end up with this idea that organizations are emerging structures in need of emerging behaviors, emerging leaders as well. They are contexts that they are in need of constant adaptability. We need to be flexible, agile, in order to come up with models or behaviors that function in the everyday organizational routine. To some extent, not even models or structures can work anymore. We actually need to be constantly adapting. So we end up with this idea of practice, where we replace management with managing and leadership with leading. Why? Because these are practices that they change every day. So we end up with what we call the practice-based view on leadership, which is the perspective that we are choosing for this paper, but generally when we want to analyze leadership, not as a structure, but as an ongoing practice. And drawing on Ladke's idea, this phenomenological approach on leadership, we end up, we use a lot this idea of the leadership moment, where leadership is not exercised. Leadership is not about the leader making the decision and then implementing a specific policy, but it's actually about the interaction of the leader with followers, a purpose, a context, leading to this unique leadership moment. And it is a unique moment because we will never be able to replicate the same practice in the same context and have the same results. So leadership can only be expressed through particular localized conditions and the individuals who take part in both creating and making sense of it. Now you see where we're going with this. I mean, when we're talking about complex, unstructured, organizations without enough resources, does this ring a bell? Does this remind you of specific context? Voluntary organizations, not-for-profit organizations, who can never have this fixed, well-regulated structure and then rely on this particular structure. It has to reinvent itself every day. And that's why we see this phenomenological practice-based view very well related and linked to NGOs, not-for-profit organizations, and voluntary organizations. Believe it or not, some of our previous work on resilience and by using quantitative empirical data from the UK, Italy, and Greece in a forthcoming paper highlights how NGOs, can be sometimes more resilient than big corporations. So big structures, big corporations with all the resources, access to funds, with all this money and all these complicated, nice structures, quite often fail, where other organizations with limited resources, without structures, relying on volunteers, for example, have more abilities to be resilient, to survive crises, and even prosper and blossom under difficult times and crises. And for us, this is a starting point. What is happening in the voluntary sector in some organizations that leads them to be more resilient, that helps them become better organizations? And we know, of course, for example, in Region and OR, that leadership in non-profit organizations is extremely complex, but it can be also very effective under certain conditions. And these are the conditions, to some extent, that we want to investigate. By the way, again, looking at not-for-profit organizations, they are part of this fluidity, this complexity. They are by definition complex if we look at the literature. So in our research, what are we looking for? We are looking to investigate the resource process, first of all, how leaders are dealing with the scarcity of resources in the voluntary sector. Is it part of the daily reality? It is. I mean, it was mentioned before, I think, by John at some point, that the NPOs, they need to have funds for the next 3 to 6 months. This in itself is not how a business organization would work for. I mean, they need to have at least a 5-year plan, for instance. So you see how there is a different horizon, there is a different time, understanding of time and resources in non-for-profit organizations. We also want to understand the symbolic process, how leaders of these organizations exercise influence without authority. I mean, in sociology of work, we still cannot understand how people are waking up every morning and they go to work. It does not make any sense for us because they have other things to do. It's not pleasant. You don't want to be here. Nobody wants to go to work every day. Still, there's the big explanation behind this, which is based on studies of the last 30 years. Well, it's for money, because people are getting paid, because they are being given money and resources to survive. Well, when it comes to voluntary organizations, when it comes to relying on work which is based on different psychological processes and complex psychological contracts, there is a symbolic process involved. We need to understand this. And also we need to understand the management process, how things happen without a formal structure, or with a structure which is very fluid, which is very flux, which is not fixed, but it can be quite efficient and quite, I would say, quite effective at the end of the day. So all this leads to an understanding of the leadership influence and effectiveness in NGOs, NPOs, and voluntary organizations. To do so, we are taking a phenomenological approach by focusing on narratives, storytelling, and attitudes in organizations, in not-for-profit organizations. This is the first part of the research that we're conducting, and this is the second part of the research that we are actually running right now, which is then try to interview leaders of the organizations themselves. However, our research strategy is that before we go into the leadership context, before we ask the leaders, we need to understand what the followers, the people working in these organizations, are thinking about leadership. By the way, there are also two parts of the research, one in the UK, the other in Greece. You are not very lucky because we finished first the analysis of the Greek data, and I'm going to present the Greek data today. So tough luck, you are stuck with the Greek data, and perhaps another conference you will enjoy the data from the UK. Apologies for this. I know Greece is not exactly a nice context in the last few years to talk about. Our research design is fairly simple. We want to explore leadership views and narratives. We interviewed people working in voluntary organizations. By the way, we thought of incorporating a focus group as well as part of the research design. It didn't work. This was a big disaster, so we dropped this research method. I mean, I can tell you later why this was one of the biggest, one of the saddest moments in my research life. But also we try to combine some observation as well as part of this phenomenological approach, where we are trying to understand the practice. And by the way, when we're talking about interviews, these were conducted in a relatively innovative spirit, where we were following the people, as they were involved in doing some work. We spend a day with them rather than spending an hour in a room isolated. I know this is not exactly a replication of reality, however, it does provide some glimpse into their practice. And observation and taking field notes was a fundamental part of our research. We set out a few rules about who should be interviewed or followed to be at work more than 20 years and with a direct access to the CEO. Now, the organizations we have analyzed are three, I would say, iconic organizations in Greece. These are the three largest NGOs in Greece. Their names and their brand are almost associated with specific charity work. For example, even when it comes to protecting the rights of the children and supporting children in Greece, this organization, the Smile of the Child, to some extent replaces governmental processes. Even the government would use the services of this organization in specific contexts and cases. It was founded in 1995, then the Doctors of the World founded in 2001. This is an international organization, and we have been investigating the Greek branch. And then we have another Institute on Road Safety, and all these three organizations, by the way, they are 90% relying on volunteers. So they don't have the funds, they don't have the resources to recruit people. By the way, this is Greece, you know, it's not that the governmental money is pouring into those organizations. So they're heavily relying on people who contribute with their everyday work. They contribute with their lives. By the way, there is another similarity across those three organizations, which is that they were all founded by passionate individuals, founders who are still leading those organizations, who also had some traumatic experience, and this is related with the analysis later on. For instance, Konstantinos Giannopoulos, who founded the Smile of the Child, he lost his own child back in 1995, and he founded this organization because he felt that children should be happy even when they are sick, for example. You know, we need to provide more happiness. And same goes for Nikitas, and also Vasiliki Milona founded this Road Safety and Driving Safety Institute when she lost her young boy, actually he was 22 years old, in a car accident. So there is this element where these very successful organizations started from personal initiatives, from the initiatives of these particular individuals. Now, what do we find out? First of all, that followers in these organizations, volunteers, they appreciate three particular elements of the leadership practice. First, the leader as a problem solver, and the ability of the leader to actually micromanage, understand the issues, resolve the issues, and provide solutions when they are needed. Which, for business organizations, this is not how we treat leadership. Leaders should be isolated from the actual practice space. They should be up there in the boardroom, making abstract decisions, providing missions, visions, and directions. But we see how effective leadership for these followers is linked with problem solving as well. Second, the leader as a public speaker. People working in these organizations, and this is a pattern, I would say, although we don't like to use the word pattern, we're actually appreciating all of them, the ability of the leader to go outside the context of the organization, express the message, provide, if you like, a public narrative, dominate the public discourse, and come back to the organization with additional resources. So this ability to set the public agenda, if you like. And finally, the leader as balancing limitations, because those people, they're experiencing problems every day coming from different directions, and the ability of the leader to balance those limitations and maintain stability is being appreciated as a key aspect of leadership. So if we look at the interview material, if we look at the practice, if we listen to their feelings and emotions about leadership, they feel that these are the three key attributes. Now, this is a quite complex model to say something which is not actually very complex. It highlights where leadership commitment is coming from the part of the people. It's coming from the idea that leaders are securing funding. It's coming from the idea that they have a strong media projection, that they know actually what it takes to go out there and bring back positive results. So what they appreciate is this the many faces, if you like, of the leader, who is not just about the passionate individual who knows about the mission and the vision of the company, but it's this, if you like, this heroic figure that can bring back positive results. And all these links to some extent to authenticity, but also to a servant and humble approach. I mean, when we were following those people, we found out that they were not thinking of their leader as a leader. They were thinking of their leader as a servant, as a friend, as a colleague, if you like, as somebody who they had constantly access to. And again, you see how we try to understand how this influences their commitment, how this has a big effect in how they work for the organization, but also has a big effect in how they construct collective memories, shared beliefs. So it's not about them subscribing to the vision as much as feeling that they're becoming part of the vision and the mission statement of this particular firm. But when we look back to the leader himself or herself on those three cases, we also look at their personal stories, a drive for triggering change, but also what John mentioned before as well, the founder-father syndrome. So it all starts from an authentic purpose, a personal story, a narrative that makes sense to one individual, which is then transferred into the followership arena, the followership landscape, if you like. However, at the core of our analysis still lies the ability of the leader to develop a leadership habitus, a structure, problem solving, as we said before, but also to engage the public sphere for their cause. We actually think that one of the best possible theoretical, if you like, resources to use is Bourdieu's theory, distinction, the logic of practice, where Pierre Bourdieu, as a sociologist and a philosopher, he argued that what is extremely important in society is the symbolic capital. When people make decisions about their lives, about shopping, about voting, about traveling, about which university they're going to work for, they make a symbolic decision and they subscribe to symbolic value. So in that sense, those people working in the volunteer organizations, they try to increase their symbolic capital themselves. They look at the positive image of the organization out there, they look at the leader, their leader as an ambassador in the society, and they want to follow this as well. Now, going back to John's presentation, whether this is positive or negative, it remains to be seen, because it could be that they subscribe to an illusion, to something which is perhaps rotten and highly problematic. In this case, we could talk about cases of toxic leadership. But however, this is their feelings, and this is how they actually behave. I'm not going to focus a lot on quotes and the symbolic process. I just want to highlight another interesting finding, which is about skills. When we talk to those people about whether they appreciate the skills of the leader, whether all those skills that we teach to those MBA programs were present and visible, they were saying absolutely not. I mean, I chose the pictures of the three leaders that we are talking about, and of course you cannot tell from their face about their skills, but I can definitely validate that these are not charismatic speakers. Now, believe it or not, they are not. They are not those kind of individuals that you would imagine as being dominant in the room. But they don't have the typical skills, if you like. They have something else, which we argue is authenticity. They have principles, they have values, and they have the problem solving and the media capacity. And that's what drives their influence within the systems. They even say that they lack presentation skills, they are shy, they lack rhetoric skills. And you see this contradiction between the lack of skills, but the other side, which is the efficiency and the influence these leaders exercise. So we theorize in our paper the leadership moment, arguing that there is actually a field in these organizations where the leader, the founder, is dominating the field, and we move the follower to the inside of the model. We are arguing that those leaders exercise symbolic domination in the organizational systems. They strongly influence people, and that might explain why we can end up with big scandals and why we can end up with problems when people are not even willing to see the reality and they subscribe to the vision, to the abstract mission. I'm out of time probably, or do you have a minute or two? Okay, yes. So we are conscious of the limitations of this research, both theoretically and empirically speaking. Greece is not exactly the best market to analyze when it comes to NGOs. We have the founder effect, and we need to understand that when a leader is also the founder of the company, there are particular dynamics that we have to appreciate. That could be a limitation. But also, in terms of our research method and design, we're conscious of a particular bias effect or a particular negative effect, which is people's enthusiasm. Because when you follow people in their work, when you observe people, when they feel proud for the services they're providing for voluntary organizations, there is this element of overexcitement. So we, to some extent, we could not bring them back to negative aspects or to the actual analysis of the reality. And I felt sometimes myself that they wanted to focus on the positives. And I think this is something that we have to acknowledge in this research. And also the memory problem, because all their memories are mediated by strong narratives, storytelling, and dominant iconic stories that they seem to be influencing a lot how they think about the leader of the organization. So you try to move them away into other memories in a psychoanalytic approach, if you like, but they're fixated into those big, big stories. You know, remember when he went on the media and he did this, you know, and then that's all they can see in their analysis. Of course, there is an ambitious plan to, there's always a plan to extend the research, right? I mean, further implications. So thank you for your attention, and hopefully it was, as I said, quick and painful. Yes.